On their wedding night, she begged him to wait. Clara Vance was 19 years old, a mail-order bride with no family, no money, and scars no one could see. When her new husband reached for her in the darkness, her body remembered things her mind tried to forget. Rough hands, whiskey breath, a voice telling her to stop fighting. She expected him to take what the law said was his right. Instead, Silas Thorne rolled away. He slept on top of the quilt, fully clothed, and he never touched her again without permission. The whole town whispered. They called her cold, broken. They said the marriage was a fraud. Then a wealthy land grabber saw their weakness. He wanted their ranch, and he was willing to burn barns, forge documents, and hire a killer to get it. But he made one terrible mistake. He underestimated what a broken woman would do to protect the only man who ever treated her like a person. Stay until the very end, because this story will show you what real love looks like when it chooses patience over force. This story teaches us that healing cannot be demanded. It can only be given space to grow. It reminds us that the strongest marriages are built not on rights or expectations, but on patience, respect, and the courage to wait for someone who has been wounded. True love does not take. True love waits. If this story touched something deep inside you, drop a comment and tell me, have you ever been given the gift of patience when you needed it most? I would love to hear your story. Hit that like button if you believe real strength is knowing when not to use your power. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that reminds you what love is supposed to look like. Share this with someone who needs to know that broken things can still become whole. Your share might change how they see their own healing. The wind in Bitter Creek did not just blow. It punished. It came screaming down from the Blue Mountains like something alive and angry. It ripped across the dry sage fields. It slammed into the little town with the force of a hammer. Dust spun through the main street in twisting devils. Windows rattled. Hope got stripped away from anyone still foolish enough to hold on to it. Inside the small wooden church, the world felt tight and breathless. The walls smelled of old beeswax and dry timber. Sunlight cut through the dusty windows in hard yellow slices. Clara Vance stood near the altar. She was 19 years old, but the shadows under her eyes made her look much older. She twisted her fingers into the rough fabric of a borrowed dress. The dress was charcoal gray, too tight in the waist, too loose in the shoulders. It smelled like someone else's life. She stared at the floorboards and counted the knots in the wood. 1, 2, 3. It was the only way to keep her fear from choking her. The pews behind her were filled with curious townspeople. Hard-faced women whispered behind their bonnets. Ranch hands watched her like she was a stray dog someone had dragged in off the street. Clara heard the whispers. She always heard the whispers. No family, no money, no dowry. Lucky any man agreed to take her at all. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to melt into the floorboards and vanish forever. But she had nowhere else to go. This marriage was her only chance at survival. The heavy church doors opened with a groan. Wind screamed inside for just a moment. Then the doors slammed shut again. Heavy boots thudded against the wooden floor. Each step echoed through the silent church. Clara did not look up. She kept her eyes on the floor. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. Silas Thorne walked down the aisle. Dust covered his long canvas coat, turning it the same brown color as the land outside. He was tall and broad-shouldered. He moved like a man who had known heavy work his whole life. His dark hair was streaked with gray at the temples. A pale scar cut down his left cheek and disappeared into his beard. He did not look like a groom. He looked like a rancher trying to finish business before the sun went down. He stopped beside her. Clara flinched when his shadow touched her feet. She could smell him now. Horses, leather, wind, the open range. The Reverend cleared his throat. "We are gathered here," he began, "to join this man and this woman in the holy estate of matrimony." There were no hymns, no warm words, no flowers, just duty and paperwork, and two strangers standing side by side. When asked, Silas said his vow in a low rumble. I do. When asked, Clara whispered so faint the words almost disappeared in the dusty air. I do. There was no kiss, there was no celebration. The Reverend snapped his Bible shut, and that was it. Done. Finished. Clara Vance was now Clara Thorne, wife of a man she had met exactly twice before today. Outside, the wind tore at Clara's skirt as Silas helped her climb into the wagon. His hand was rough and warm against her arm. She flinched again. She could not help it. Every touch made her body remember things she desperately wanted to forget. Silas paused, just for a second. Then he lifted her with quiet care, like she was something fragile. They left the town behind. The wagon wheels rattled over the hard-packed earth. Clara sat small and tense beside him, her hands folded tight in her lap. She stared at the endless land stretching out before them. Brown grass, gray sage, mountains so far away they looked like a dream. The open range made her feel even more alone. A single gray wolf watched them from a ridge. Its yellow eyes tracked the wagon for a long moment. Then it turned and vanished into the brush. "It is a fair piece yet," Silas said suddenly. Clara jumped at the sound of his voice. It was deep, but not unkind. She only nodded. By the time they reached the ranch, night had swallowed the valley whole. Stars scattered across the sky like spilled sugar. The house was solid but plain, built from weathered logs that had fought the elements for years. A windmill creaked in the darkness. The whole place looked like it had battled the land and refused to give up. "You go on inside," Silas said as he stopped the wagon. "Door is unlocked." Clara climbed down on shaking legs. She walked to the door and pushed it open. Warm lamplight spilled across her borrowed shoes. The room inside was clean but bare. No curtains, no flowers, no soft touches anywhere. Just a rough-hewn table, 2 wooden chairs, and the cold silence of a bachelor's life. When Silas came in a few minutes later, he moved heavily. He washed his hands and face at the basin in the corner. Then he set out supper without a word, stew from the pot, bread that was 3 days old, water from the well. They ate in silence. Clara could feel his eyes on her, not angry, not demanding, just watching, studying her like she was a puzzle he never asked for, but now had to solve. After dinner, he stood. "Bedroom is through here," he said quietly. Clara's stomach twisted into a knot. Her legs trembled as she followed him down the short hallway. The bedroom held a large iron bed covered in thick quilts. The pillows were flat from use. The whole room smelled like cedar and dust. Silas set the lamp down on the bedside table. Shadows stretched along the walls like long fingers. "I will turn my back," he said softly, "so you can prepare." Clara's hands shook as she fumbled with the buttons of her borrowed dress. The fabric whispered against her skin as it fell. She pulled on the thin nightgown that had been laid out for her. Then she slipped into bed and pulled the quilt all the way up to her chin. "I am ready," she whispered. Silas blew out the lamp. Darkness swallowed the room. The mattress dipped as he lay down beside her. Clara felt his warmth before she felt his hand. His fingers touched her shoulder, gentle, hesitant, like he was afraid of scaring a wild animal. But her body did not know gentle. Her body only knew what had come before. The memory hit her like a scream. Rough hands, the smell of whiskey, being pinned down with no escape. A voice telling her to stop fighting, pain that tore through her like fire. Her breath came fast and ragged. She curled away from him, trembling so hard the whole bed shook. "It hurts," she gasped. The words tumbled out in a desperate rush. "I'm sorry. I cannot. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe another night." Silas went completely still. Then he pulled back, slowly, quietly. He sat on the edge of the bed with his head in his hands. The darkness pressed down on both of them. The world told him he had a right. The law told him he had a right. But the sound of her crying in the dark cut deeper than any knife ever could. He lay back down. But he stayed on top of the quilt, fully clothed, facing away from her. The space between them felt as wide as the prairie outside. Clara cried herself to sleep. Silas lay awake. He stared at the dark ceiling and listened to the wind batter the house. He had wanted a partner, a family, a future, an heir for this land he had worked so hard to build. But lying beside him was a girl who trembled at his touch, a girl who feared him down to her bones, and he did not know what to do about it. Morning came cold and bright. When Clara woke, the other side of the bed was empty. Silas was already gone. On the kitchen table sat a pot of hot coffee and a folded piece of paper. She picked up the note. The handwriting was rough but readable. Back at noon. Clara washed her face with cold water. Then she went back to the bedroom and stripped the bed. She stared at the sheets for a long moment. They were completely untouched. In town, the story spread faster than wildfire. By noon, everyone knew. Everyone was talking, and the words they used were sharp as broken glass. She would not let him touch her. The marriage is not real. Something is wrong with that girl. The wind carried those whispers all the way back to the ranch. Clara felt each one like a knife between her ribs. Silas felt each one like proof of his failure. And the harsh, silent land around them waited to see what would come next. The days on the Thorn Ranch were long and hard and unforgiving. Clara woke before sunrise every morning. She pulled on her dress with fingers still stiff from sleep. The floorboards were cold beneath her bare feet. The house was always cold in those early hours before the stove had time to chase away the night. Silas would already be up. He would be stoking the fire in the kitchen, his broad back bent over the iron stove. He never said good morning. He just nodded when she came into the room. Breakfast was simple. Strong coffee that could strip paint. Salt pork fried until the edges curled. Bread that got harder every day. They ate like strangers, forced together by circumstances neither of them had chosen. After breakfast, Silas rode out to work the cattle. The front door would close behind him, and the house would fall silent. That silence pressed against Clara's ears like hands trying to smother her. So she filled it with work. She scrubbed the floors until her knees ached. She hauled water from the stubborn old pump behind the house. The handle fought her every time, creaking and groaning like it resented being used. But she kept pulling until the bucket filled. She battled the endless Wyoming dust that seeped through every crack in the walls. No matter how much she cleaned, there was always more. It was like fighting the land itself. But she kept going. She needed to be useful. She needed to prove she was not just a burden. She needed to earn her place in this house since she could not earn it in the bedroom. One morning, Clara decided to plant a garden near the kitchen door. She found some old seeds in a tin on a high shelf. Carrots, beans, maybe some kind of squash. The paper labels had faded too much to read. The soil fought her like an enemy. It was hard as stone, baked dry by the relentless sun. Clara dug until her knuckles cracked and bled. She dug until blisters rose on her palms and then burst. She kept digging anyway. She planted the seeds one by one. She watered them every day, carrying bucket after bucket from the pump. When dust devils spun too close, she threw herself over the little patch of dirt, shielding the seeds with her own body. Days passed, then weeks. And then one morning, Clara saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. Green shoots, tiny and fragile, pushing up through the hard earth, reaching toward the sun like little prayers. She almost cried. It was such a small thing, just a few green sprouts in the dirt, but it felt like proof that something could grow here, that she could make something grow, even in this harsh and unforgiving place. Silas noticed. He did not say much. He never said much. But Clara caught him glancing at her little garden when he rode back in the evenings. She saw him studying the new curtains she had stitched together from old feed sacks. She watched him turn his mended shirt over in his hands, running his thumb across the neat stitches she had made. Sometimes he even smiled. It was just a small lift at the corner of his mouth, gone almost before she could see it. But it was there. Those small moments gave Clara hope. Maybe this could work. Maybe they could build something together, even if it was not the marriage either of them had expected. But the nights stayed difficult. Every evening, when the lamp went out and darkness filled the bedroom, Clara felt the fear come crawling back. It lived in her chest like a cold stone, heavy and impossible to shift. Silas would lie beside her carefully. He moved slowly, giving her time to adjust. He would reach out with gentle hands, touching her shoulder or her arm, waiting for her to relax. But the moment his weight shifted toward her, panic exploded in her chest. Her breath would catch. Her body would freeze. The fear would rise up like a storm, blocking out everything else. She could not think. She could not move. She could not do anything except remember. Those rough hands, that smell of whiskey, that voice telling her to stop fighting. "It hurts," she would whisper, tears spilling onto the pillow. "I am sorry, maybe later, maybe tomorrow." And Silas would roll away. He never yelled, he never forced. But Clara felt the weight of his disappointment like a stone pressing on her ribs. He wanted a family, a future, an heir for this ranch he had built with his own hands. And she could not give him any of it. The whispers in town only made everything worse. Every time Clara went to get supplies, she felt the stares. She heard the murmurs that stopped when she got too close. She saw the judgmental looks from women who believed they knew her whole story. She is cold. She is broken. She tricked him. The marriage is not real. One afternoon, Clara was standing near the fabric bolts at the general store. She was trying to decide if she could afford a yard of cotton for new pillowcases. It was the kind of small thing that might make the house feel more like a home. Then she heard the voices behind her. "Some girls freeze up because they are hiding something," Mrs. Gable said to her friend. Her voice was low, but not low enough. Maybe she is not as pure as she claimed. Clara's hand jerked. The spool of thread she had been holding dropped to the floor and rolled away. She tried to pick it up, but her hands were shaking too badly. She left the store without buying anything. When Silas found her in the wagon later, her face was pale as milk. Her whole body was trembling. He climbed up beside her and took the reins, but he did not start the horses moving. "What happened?" he asked quietly. Clara shook her head. "Nothing," she whispered. "Can we go home, please?" But that night, after another failed attempt that left her crying into her pillow, Clara begged him. "Maybe something is wrong with me," she said. "Maybe a doctor can fix it. Make it so I can be a proper wife." Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. The next day, he took her to see Dr. Morris. The examination was cold and humiliating. Dr. Morris asked rude questions without looking at her face. He handled her like she was machinery that needed inspecting. He poked and prodded while Clara stared at the ceiling and tried not to cry. When it was over, he scribbled some notes on a piece of paper. "You are perfectly healthy," he said with a bored shrug, "just nervous. Some women are like that. Need a firm hand to get them past it." He tore the paper off his pad and held it out. "Have your husband push through it. Nature will settle the rest." Clara felt sick. Silas took the paper outside. Clara followed him on legs that felt like they might give out. She watched him unfold the note and read it. His face turned to stone. She waited for him to agree with the doctor. She waited for him to say the doctor was right. She waited for him to tell her he would not tiptoe around her fear anymore. Instead, Silas struck a match. He held the flame to the corner of the paper and watched it burn. The fire ate through the doctor's instructions, turning them to ash. When there was nothing left but a black curl of paper, Silas dropped it in the dirt. Then he ground it under his boot heel. "We are going home," he said. That night, Clara broke. She found Silas in the kitchen, washing up from supper. He stood with his back to her, and for a moment she just watched him. This man who had every right to force her but chose not to. This man who burned a doctor's note rather than use it against her. "He made me feel small," she said. Her voice cracked on the words. Silas turned around slowly. Clara was shaking. Tears ran down her face, but she could not stop talking now that she had started. "He made me feel like I was something broken, something to fix or force, like I was not even a person." She covered her face with her hands. "I am scared, Silas. Not of you, but of being used again, of disappearing again." Silas did not touch her. He moved slowly, carefully, stopping several feet away, close enough to hear her, far enough not to crowd her. "I will never take what is not freely given," he said softly. "If this is all we ever are, you will still be my wife. You will still have a home here." His voice was low and rough, but the words were gentle. "You are safe here, Clara." Her knees buckled. Silas caught her carefully. He held her lightly, gently, as if she might shatter in his arms. Clara pressed her face against his chest and sobbed. All the fear, all the shame, all the loneliness of the past weeks came pouring out. And Silas just held her. That night, something changed. He lay beside her on his back, arms at his sides, not touching. Just there, present, patient. After a long time, Clara's hand slid across the quilt. Her fingers found his in the darkness. Slowly, hesitantly, she laced her fingers through his. Silas's hand curled around hers. Warm, strong, safe. It was not much, just two hands holding each other in the dark. But it was a bridge, the first bridge between two wounded hearts. Spring did not come gently to Bitter Creek. It came screaming across the plains with storms that could kill a man in minutes, rain that turned to ice, snow that fell sideways, wind that cut through clothes like they were made of paper. Clara learned to watch the sky now. She learned to read the clouds like words on a page. When the air turned sharp and the light went gray, she knew trouble was coming. One afternoon in late March, the sky went darker than she had ever seen. Silas had ridden out to check on a section of fence that had come down in the last storm. The cattle had been drifting, and he needed to push them back before they wandered too far. "I will be back before nightfall," he said as he mounted his horse. Clara nodded and watched him ride away until he was just a speck against the gray land. Then she went inside to start supper. An hour later, the blizzard hit. It came without warning. One moment the sky was dark but quiet. The next moment, white fury swallowed the world. Snow fell so thick Clara could not see the barn from the kitchen window. The wind screamed around the house like something alive and angry. She thought about Silas out there somewhere, lost in that white wall of death. Her heart squeezed tight in her chest. "Please be safe," she whispered. "Please find shelter." The hours crawled by. Clara kept the fire burning hot. She paced from the stove to the window and back again. Night fell, but she could not tell. Everything was the same shade of howling white. Then she heard it. A sound cutting through the wind, high and terrified. A horse screaming. Clara grabbed her coat and ran to the door. When she opened it, the wind almost knocked her flat. Snow stung her face like needles. She could barely see 3 feet in front of her. But she could hear the horse. It was coming from the north pasture. The sound was pure panic. Something was wrong. Clara pulled her coat tight and stepped into the storm. The snow was already up to her knees. Each step felt like dragging through mud. The wind pushed against her so hard she had to lean into it just to stay upright. She followed the screaming. The sound led her to the far fence near the creek that was now just a frozen white line in the ground. Through the swirling snow, Clara saw movement. A calf. One of the spring calves had gotten separated from the herd. It was stuck in a snowdrift near the fence, bawling in terror. And behind it, barely visible through the white curtain of snow, Clara could see dark shapes moving. Cattle. Running. The storm had spooked the herd. They were stampeding blind, running from the wind and the noise. Running straight toward the trapped calf. Running straight toward Clara. She did not think. She ran. Her legs burned. Her lungs ached from the frozen air. She reached the calf and tried to pull it free, but the snow had packed around its legs like cement. "Come on!" she gasped. "Come on, you have to move!" The thunder of hooves grew louder. The ground shook. Clara looked up and saw the dark mass of panicked cattle bearing down on her. She was going to die. She knew it with sudden cold certainty. She was going to be trampled in the snow, and no one would find her body until spring. Then something slammed into her from the side. Arms wrapped around her waist. A body drove her sideways through the snow. She hit the ground hard. All the air knocked from her lungs. Something heavy rolled over her, pressing her into a shallow ditch. Hooves thundered past. So close she could feel the vibration in her bones. So close the wind from their passing stirred her hair. Then it was over. The stampede moved on, swallowed by the white curtain of the storm. Clara lay in the snow, gasping for breath, trying to understand what had happened. A weight shifted off her. Hands grabbed her arms and pulled her up. Silas. His face was red with cold. Ice hung from his beard. His eyes were wild with fear and fury. "What were you thinking?" he shouted. The wind nearly stole his words. "You could have died. You could have been trampled." Clara could not answer. Her teeth were chattering too hard. Her whole body was shaking. Silas grabbed her face in both hands. His palms were rough and ice-cold, but the touch was not violent. It was desperate. The anger in his eyes melted into something else. Terror. Pure terror at the thought of losing her. "Don't ever do that again," he said. His voice cracked. "You hear me? Don't you ever." Then he pulled her against his chest and held on like he would never let go. They made it back to the house somehow. Clara did not remember the walk. She just remembered Silas's arm around her, his body blocking the wind, his voice in her ear telling her to keep moving. Just keep moving, we are almost there. Inside, warmth hit her like a wall. Silas stripped off her frozen coat and wrapped her in quilts by the fire. He made hot coffee and pressed the cup into her shaking hands. "Drink," he ordered. "You need to warm up from the inside." Clara drank. The coffee burned her throat, but she did not care. She could feel her fingers again. She could feel her toes. She was alive. She looked at Silas. He was kneeling by the fire, poking at the logs. His clothes were soaked through. His hands were shaking too. He had ridden through a blizzard to get home. Then he had thrown himself between her and a stampede. "You saved me," she said softly. Silas did not look up. Stupid thing to do. Running into a stampede like that. "I was trying to save the calf." "It is a calf," he said. His voice was rough. "You are my wife." Clara set down her coffee cup. She reached out and touched his arm. He went still. "Thank you," she whispered. Silas finally looked at her. His eyes were red-rimmed. From the cold or from something else, she could not tell. "I thought I lost you," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Thought I would find you dead in the snow. And I realized—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "Realized what?" Clara asked. "That I do not want to do this without you. Any of it. The ranch, the life. None of it matters if you're not here." Clara's heart squeezed tight. Something warm bloomed in her chest. Something that felt like hope. That night, they sat by the fire wrapped in blankets. The storm raged outside, but inside was warm and safe. Clara leaned against Silas's shoulder. He put his arm around her. It was the closest they had ever been. "Come to bed," she whispered finally. Silas froze. He turned to look at her, searching her face for fear. But all he saw was nervous hope. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I want to try," she said. "I want to be close to you." They went to the bedroom together. Silas moved carefully, watching her the whole time. Clara's heart pounded, but this time it was not entirely from fear. They lay down together. Silas was gentle, so gentle it made her want to cry. His hands were soft. His voice was a low murmur in the darkness, telling her she was beautiful, telling her she was brave, telling her she could stop whenever she needed to. Clara wanted this. She did. She wanted to feel his warmth, his closeness, his love. But when his weight shifted over her, the old terror snapped back into place. It was like a trap slamming shut. Suddenly she could not breathe. Her vision went dark at the edges. The room disappeared, and she was somewhere else. Somewhere terrible, with rough hands and whiskey breath and a voice telling her to stop fighting. She gasped and curled away from him. Tears streamed down her face. "I am sorry," she choked out. "I am so sorry. I cannot. I wanted to. I tried, but I cannot." She buried her face in the pillow. "You deserve someone whole," she sobbed. "Someone who can give you what you need. Not a broken thing like me." Silas sat back. His breathing was ragged. His hands were clenched at his sides. The frustration rolled off him in waves. Then something snapped. He slammed his fist into the log wall. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Clara screamed and curled into a ball, her arms over her head. Her whole body shook with fresh terror. Silas stared at his hand. Blood dripped from his knuckles where the rough wood had torn his skin. Horror spread across his face. "What have I done?" he whispered. He stumbled backward, nearly fell. Then he turned and ran out into the night. The bedroom door slammed behind him. Then the front door. Then there was only silence and the howling wind. Clara lay curled in the bed, crying so hard she could barely breathe. She had driven him away. She had finally pushed him past his limit. Now he would realize what a mistake he had made. Now he would send her away. She was going to lose everything. Silas did not come back until dawn. When the door finally opened, Clara was sitting at the kitchen table. She had not slept. Her eyes were swollen from crying. She flinched when she saw him. He looked terrible. His clothes were damp with snow. His face was gray with exhaustion. His hand was wrapped in a torn piece of his shirt, spotted with blood. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her. "I am sorry," he said, voice rough and broken. "I should not have done that. I scared you. After everything I promised." He took a step closer, then stopped, like he was afraid to get too near. "I will never do that again," he said. "I swear on my life. I will never raise my hand where you can see it." Clara stared at him. She should have been afraid. Part of her was afraid. But another part of her saw the truth in his eyes, the shame, the regret, the desperate need to make things right. "I know," she whispered. Silas let out a breath that shook his whole body. He slumped into the chair across from her. "We are a pair," he said quietly. "Both of us broken in our own ways." Clara reached across the table. Her hand covered his injured one. The bandage was rough beneath her fingers. "Maybe broken things can still fit together," she said. The days that followed were quiet. Careful, they moved around each other like two people learning to dance for the first time. Not touching much, but staying close. Silas slept by the hearth now. He said it was more comfortable, but Clara knew the truth. He was giving her space, giving her time. She appreciated it. She hated it. She did not know what she wanted anymore. But something was changing between them. Something slow and careful and fragile as those first green shoots in her garden. They were learning to trust each other. And they were going to need that trust, because trouble was coming. The kind of trouble that could destroy everything they were building together. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday, carried in the weathered hands of Sheriff Miller. Clara saw him coming from the kitchen window. His horse moved slow up the long drive, kicking up dust that hung in the still air. Something about the way he sat in the saddle made her stomach clench with worry. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch. Silas came around the corner of the barn, leading his horse. He had been checking the new fence line, the one they had rebuilt after the stampede. When he saw the sheriff, his jaw tightened. "Sheriff," Silas said, voice flat, "what brings you out this way?" Sheriff Miller dismounted slow. He took off his hat and turned it in his hands. The motion made him look older somehow. Tired. "Got something for you, Silas." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a sealed envelope. The paper was heavy and official-looking. "Wish I did not have to be the one to deliver it." Silas took the envelope. His name was written across the front in fancy script. Clara moved closer, her heart pounding. "What is it?" she asked. Silas broke the seal and unfolded the letter. His eyes moved across the words. Clara watched his face go from confused to hard to something that looked like cold fury. "It is a writ of inquiry," Sheriff Miller said. "Hiram Sterling and the church elders want to challenge your marriage." Clara's knees went weak. She grabbed the porch railing to keep from falling. Challenge it how? Silas asked, voice dangerously quiet. They are claiming the marriage was never completed, that it is not legal, and if they can prove that in front of the church council, well, the sheriff looked uncomfortable. The land title might revert back to the bank. Sterling is ready to buy it up the same day. Clara understood now. The whispers in town, the rumors about her being cold, broken, unable to perform her wifely duties. Someone had turned those whispers into a weapon. He cannot do this, Clara said. Her voice shook. It is our home, our land. Sheriff Miller put his hat back on. I know it, but Sterling has money and influence. He has been buying up land all over the county. Yours is the last big parcel he needs to control the water rights on Bitter Creek. He looked at Silas with something like sympathy. The church council meets in 2 weeks. You and your wife will need to appear, answer their questions. He hesitated. Prove the marriage is real. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Prove it how, she whispered, but she already knew the answer. After the sheriff rode away, Silas stood on the porch for a long time. He held the letter in his hands, staring at it like it might catch fire. Clara stood beside him. The silence between them felt heavy as stone. This is my fault, she finally said. Silas looked at her sharply. No. Yes. She wrapped her arms around herself. If I had been a proper wife. If I could have just... She could not finish the sentence. Silas stepped closer. His hand reached out like he wanted to touch her, then dropped back to his side. None of this is your fault, Clara. Sterling has been circling this land for years, waiting for a weakness. He found one. That does not make it your fault. But the hearing, Clara said. Her voice cracked. What are we going to do? How can we prove? I don't know, Silas admitted. But we have 2 weeks. We will figure something out. That night, Clara lay awake in the dark bedroom. Silas was by the hearth, like he had been every night since he punched the wall. The house was quiet except for the wind and the occasional creak of settling wood. She thought about what was coming. The church council would ask questions, embarrassing questions. They would want to know details about her marriage bed, about what happened behind closed doors, and she would have to admit the truth, that her husband had never touched her, that their marriage existed on paper only, that she was too broken, too damaged, too afraid to be a real wife. The whole town would know. Worse, Silas would lose everything. His land, his home, his life's work, all because of her. Clara pressed her face into the pillow and cried silently. She had spent so many years feeling worthless. Now she had proof that she was. But as the tears soaked into the cotton, something else began to stir inside her. Anger. She had not asked for what happened to her. She had not chosen to be broken. Someone else had done that. Someone else had stolen her innocence and left her with scars no one could see. And now Hiram Sterling wanted to use those scars to steal something else. Her home. Her husband. The first real chance at happiness she had ever known. No. Clara sat up in the darkness. She had spent her whole life being a victim, being small, being afraid, letting other people decide what she was worth. Not anymore. She did not know how yet. But she was going to fight. She was going to stand up in that church and defend her marriage, defend her husband, defend herself. The next morning, Clara was already up when Silas came into the kitchen. Coffee was hot on the stove. Eggs were frying in the pan. She moved with a purpose he had not seen before. You are up early, he said carefully. Could not sleep. She handed him a cup of coffee. We need to talk about the hearing. Silas took the cup but did not drink. Talk about what? Strategy. Clara turned the eggs with more force than necessary. Sterling thinks we are easy targets, that I am going to hide in shame and let him take everything. He is wrong. Silas studied her face. Something in his expression shifted. Respect, maybe, or hope. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking that I am tired of being afraid, tired of letting other people control my life." She looked at him directly. "I am not going to let him win, Silas. I am not going to let him take your home." "Our home," Silas said quietly. Clara blinked. "What? You said my home. But it is our home now, yours and mine." He set down his coffee cup. "Whatever we do, whatever happens at that hearing, we do it together." Clara's throat tightened. She nodded because she did not trust her voice. For the next 2 weeks they prepared. Silas talked to neighbors, found out who on the church council might be sympathetic, learned that not everyone in town believed Sterling's version of events. Clara gathered her courage. She practiced what she might say, how she might explain her situation without falling apart. It was hard. Every time she thought about standing up in front of all those people, her hands started shaking. But she kept practicing. She was not going to let fear win. Not this time. 3 days before the hearing, Clara woke to the smell of smoke. At first she thought it was the stove. Maybe Silas had let the fire get out of control. But then she heard the screaming. A horse, terrified, panicked. She ran to the window and her heart stopped. The barn was on fire. Flames poured from the doors and windows, bright orange against the dark night sky. Smoke billowed up in thick black clouds. The horses inside were screaming. Clara did not think. She ran. She burst out the front door just as Silas came tearing around the corner. Jeb and Toby, the two ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse, were right behind him. "Get the buckets," Silas shouted. "Water from the trough! Move!" Clara grabbed a bucket and ran to the water trough. Her arms burned as she filled bucket after bucket. The heat from the barn was intense, even from 50 feet away. Silas plunged into the burning doorway without hesitation. Clara screamed his name, but he was already gone, swallowed by the smoke and flames. Seconds felt like hours. Then Silas emerged, dragging a terrified horse by its mane. He handed it off to Toby and went back in. Clara kept hauling water. Her lungs burned from the smoke. Her eyes streamed with tears. She could barely see what she was doing. Jeb took the bucket from her hands. "Get back," he shouted. "Roof is about to go." Just then, the barn roof collapsed with a thunderous crash. Sparks exploded into the sky like fireworks. Clara screamed again, but Silas was already stumbling out, another horse behind him. He was covered in soot. His shirt was singed. But he was alive. As the flames finally began to die down, something caught Silas's eye. Movement. On the ridge overlooking the ranch. A rider, sitting still, watching the chaos below, then turning and fleeing into the darkness. Silas grabbed his Winchester from the porch where he had dropped it. "Sterling's men," he growled. The fury in his voice was terrifying. "They burned our barn." He raised the rifle, lined up the shot. His finger tightened on the trigger. "Silas." Clara's voice cut through the smoke and the rage. She stepped in front of him, blocking his aim. "Look at me," she said. "Move," he ordered. His whole body was shaking with anger. "No." She did not flinch. "Sterling wants you angry. He wants you to kill someone so he can take the ranch and call it justice. Do not do what he wants." Silas's jaw clenched. Sweat dripped down his face, cutting trails through the soot. "He burned our barn," he said through gritted teeth. "I know, and we will make him answer for it. But not like this." Clara's voice shook, but she held his gaze. "Please, come back to me." For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the rifle lowered. The shot that could have ruined everything was never fired. Silas dropped the gun in the dirt. He pulled Clara against his chest and held on tight, shaking just as hard as she was. The next day, Sheriff Miller confirmed what they already knew. "Arson," he said. "Sterling's fingerprints are all over this, but he has covered his tracks well enough to stay out of reach." "So he gets away with it?" Clara asked. "For now." The sheriff looked grim. "But the church council meets tomorrow. Sterling means to use that hearing to break you. He looked at them both with something like respect. Whatever you are planning, make it good. The church was packed. Every seat in every pew was filled. People stood against the walls. They crowded near the doors. They craned their necks to see. Clara had never felt so exposed in her life. She walked down the aisle beside Silas, her chin up, her hands clasped tight in front of her. She could feel every eye on her. She could hear the whispers rustling through the crowd like wind through dry grass. There she is, the cold wife, the broken one. She kept walking. They took their seats in the front pew. Silas sat stiff-backed and silent. Clara sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. It was the closest they had sat in weeks. Reverend Prynne stood at the front of the church, looking uncomfortable in his black robes. Beside him stood Hiram Sterling, sleek and satisfied in an expensive suit. Sterling's lawyer hovered nearby, a slick man with a cold smile and sharp eyes. Sterling looked at Clara and smiled. It was the smile of a man who had already won. Clara stared back at him. She did not look away. Reverend Prynne cleared his throat and raised his hands for silence. The murmuring died down slowly. "We are gathered here," he began, "to address a matter of grave concern. A question has been raised about the validity of the marriage between Silas Thorne and Clara Vance Thorne." Clara heard the whispers start up again. She ignored them. "It has been suggested," Reverend Prynne continued, "that this marriage was never properly consummated, that it exists in name only. And if this is true, the marriage may be subject to annulment." He looked at Silas and Clara with something like pity. "Mr. Sterling has brought this matter to our attention out of concern for the sanctity of marriage in our community. His lawyer, Mr. Felton, will present the case." Sterling's lawyer stepped forward. He was smooth and polished, every word calculated for maximum effect. "Thank you, Reverend." Mr. Felton's voice carried easily through the church. "We are here today because a grave deception has been perpetrated on this community. Mr. Thorne entered into marriage with Miss Vance, believing she would fulfill her duties as a wife. But we have testimony from multiple witnesses that this marriage has never been completed." He looked around the room, making sure everyone was listening. "The marriage bed remains untouched. Mrs. Thorne refuses her husband's advances. This is not a marriage. It is a fraud." Clara's face burned, but she did not look away. "Mr. Thorne," Felton continued, turning to face Silas, "I must ask you directly. Has this marriage been consummated?" The church fell completely silent. Clara felt Silas tense beside her. His hands curled into fists on his knees. He rose halfway from his seat, ready to fight, ready to defend her honor. Then he felt a small hand on his arm. Clara stood. "I will answer," she said. A wave of gasps and whispers rushed through the room. Felton looked surprised, then amused. "Please, Mrs. Thorne." He gestured toward the front of the church. "We are all eager to hear your testimony." Clara walked into the center aisle. Her legs trembled beneath her skirts, but she kept her back straight. She turned to face the congregation. All those eyes, all those judging faces, all those people who thought they knew her story. "My husband has not bedded me," she said. Her voice trembled at first, but with each word it grew stronger. "Not because he did not want to, but because I asked him not to." The gasps were louder this time. Real shock, real scandal. Clara kept talking. "I came here with scars you cannot see. Scars from men who took more than they had any right to take." She looked around the room, meeting as many eyes as she could. "When I was 16 years old, I was attacked by a man who was supposed to protect me. He held me down and he took what he wanted, and when it was over, he told me it was my fault. He told me I asked for it." The church was dead silent now. Even the whispers had stopped. Clara felt tears on her cheeks, but she did not wipe them away. "I carried that shame for 3 years. I believed I was broken. I believed I was worthless. I believed no man would ever want me once he knew the truth." She pointed toward Silas. "Then I married this man, and I waited for him to be like the others. I waited for him to take what he wanted, whether I was willing or not, because that is what men do." That is what I had learned. She shook her head slowly. But Silas was different. Her voice cracked, but she pushed through. When I froze on our wedding night, he did not force me. When I cried and begged for more time, he gave it. When a doctor told him to push through my fear, he burned the note and took me home. She was openly crying now. "You call him a fraud," she said. "You say our marriage is not real because he has not claimed his rights over my body." Her voice rose. "I call him the only decent man who has ever treated me like a person, not a thing to be used. Not a problem to be solved. A person." Sterling shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The smug smile was gone from his face. Clara turned to look directly at him. "You burned our barn," she said, loudly, clearly. "You sent men in the night to destroy what we have built. You think you can take our home because I am damaged, because I cannot perform like a good little wife should." She stepped closer to him. "But here is what you do not understand, Mr. Sterling. This marriage is real. It is real because Silas chose to wait for me. It is real because he protected me when I could not protect myself. It is real because we have built something together out of patience and kindness and respect." Her voice was steady now. "And it is real because I choose it. I choose him. I choose this life. And you cannot take that from me, no matter how many barns you burn." The church exploded in whispers. But they were different now, not judgmental, sympathetic, angry on her behalf. Sheriff Miller stood up from his seat near the back. "I have something to add," he said loudly. All eyes turned to him. The sheriff walked to the front of the church, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. "The fire at the Thorn Ranch was arson," he announced. "And I have a witness who saw two of Sterling's men riding away from the scene." More gasps, more whispers. Sterling shot to his feet. "That is a lie. You have no proof." "I have a signed statement," Sheriff Miller said calmly. "Got it this morning from Hank Cooper, who was riding fence that night and saw the whole thing." He looked at Sterling with cold satisfaction. "Funny timing, is it not? Burn their barn 3 days before the hearing. Make them weak. Make them scared. Then swoop in and take their land." Sterling's face went red, then white. Reverend Prynne stepped forward. His face was pale. "I believe we have heard enough," he said. His voice shook slightly. "Based on the testimony presented today, I see no grounds for annulment." He looked at Silas and Clara. "The marriage stands." Sterling exploded. "This is not over. I will appeal. I will take this to the territorial court. I will." "It is over for today," Silas said quietly. He had risen to his feet, standing tall and calm. "The church council has made its ruling. Now get out of my sight." For a moment, Sterling looked like he might attack. His face was purple with rage. His hands shook at his sides. Then he turned and stormed out of the church, his lawyer hurrying behind him. The doors slammed shut. And just like that, it was over. Clara's knees gave out. She would have fallen, but Silas was there. He caught her in his arms and held her tight. "You were magnificent," he murmured against her hair. "I have never been more proud of anyone in my life." Clara pressed her face against his chest. She was shaking all over. But for the first time in years, it was not from fear. It was from relief. They walked out of the church together. People reached out to touch Clara's arm as she passed. Women who had whispered about her now looked at her with respect, with understanding, with tears in their eyes. One woman stopped her near the door. She was older, with gray hair and a lined face. "What you did in there," the woman said quietly. "That took courage, real courage." She squeezed Clara's hand. "You are not alone," she whispered. "More of us understand than you know." Clara could only nod. Her throat was too tight for words. Outside, the sun was setting. The sky burned orange and pink above the mountains. The wind had died down, leaving the air still and warm. Silas helped Clara into the wagon. Then he climbed up beside her and took the reins. "Ready to go home?" he asked. Clara looked at him, at this man who had waited for her, who had protected her, who had let her fight her own battle while standing ready to catch her if she fell. "Yes," she whispered. "Let us go home." The wagon rolled out of town, leaving the whispers and the judgment behind. Ahead of them, the road stretched long and dusty toward the ranch. Their ranch. Their home. Silas took one hand off the reins and reached for hers. Clara laced her fingers through his without hesitation. They rode home in silence. But it was a different kind of silence now. Not heavy with tension and unspoken fears. Light. Peaceful. Full of possibility. Summer came to Bitter Creek soft and slow. The harsh winds of spring faded into gentle breezes. The brown grass turned green. Wildflowers bloomed in patches of purple and yellow across the hills. And on the Thorn Ranch, things were changing too. Clara's garden flourished. The seeds she had fought so hard to plant had grown into rows of vegetables. Tomatoes ripened on the vine. Beans climbed up the poles she had fashioned from fallen branches. Squash spread their broad leaves across the dirt. Every morning she walked through the garden and touched the plants like they were her children. In a way they were, proof that she could nurture something, proof that her hands could create, not just endure. The house was different now, too. Clara had sewn real curtains from fabric Silas had brought back from town, blue gingham cheerful against the rough log walls. She had made a tablecloth to match, had found an old vase in the barn and filled it with wildflowers, small things. But they made the house feel like a home. Silas noticed every change. He never said much. That was his way. But Clara saw him pause in the doorway some evenings, looking around like he was seeing the place for the first time. She saw the way his eyes lingered on the curtains, the flowers, the quilt she had mended, and hung across the back of his chair. Once, she caught him smiling at the garden when he thought she was not looking. Their nights were different now, too. After the church hearing, something had shifted between them. The wall of fear was still there, but it had cracks in it now. Light was getting through. Silas still slept by the hearth most nights. He said he did not want to pressure her, and she loved him for it. She loved him. The realization came quietly, sneaking up on her one afternoon while she was hanging laundry on the line. She loved the way he moved, slow and deliberate, like every action mattered. She loved the rough sound of his voice when he talked to the horses. She loved the way he looked at her now, not with expectation or frustration, but with something softer. Patience. Hope. She loved him, and she wanted to be his wife, really his wife. But the fear was still there, smaller than before, but still present. A cold knot in her chest that tightened whenever she thought about being touched that way. She did not know how to untie it. One evening in late July, Clara found Silas on the porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. He sat in the old rocking chair, a cup of coffee in his hands, watching the colors change. Clara sat in the chair beside him. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Silas said quietly, "Tell me about before." Clara went still. "Before," she repeated. "Before you came here. Before me." He did not look at her. "Only if you want to. I just thought maybe it would help to say it out loud." Clara's throat tightened. She had never told anyone the full story. Even at the church hearing, she had only shared pieces. The shame of it was too heavy, too dark. But sitting here with the sunset warm on her face and Silas beside her, she felt something loosen in her chest. "His name was Benjamin," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "He was my mother's brother. He came to live with us after my father died." Silas did not move, did not react, just listened. "I was 16. My mother worked long hours to keep us fed. She trusted him to look after me. She did not know." Clara's hands twisted in her lap. "The first time, I did not understand what was happening. I thought I had done something wrong. made him angry somehow. He said if I told anyone, no one would believe me. He said I would be the one punished. A tear slid down her cheek. It went on for almost a year. Then my mother died, and I ran. I had nowhere to go, no money, no family. I worked where I could, cleaned houses, washed clothes. Sometimes I did not eat for days. She took a shaky breath. When I saw the advertisement for a mail-order bride, I thought it was my only chance. A way to start over, to be someone new. She finally looked at Silas. His face was hard, but not with anger at her. His jaw was clenched tight. His knuckles were white around his coffee cup. "I am sorry I could not tell you before," Clara whispered. "I was so ashamed." Silas set down his cup. He turned to face her fully. "You have nothing to be ashamed of," he said. His voice was rough with emotion. "What he did was evil, not you. Never you." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. His hand covered hers. "I am sorry that happened to you," he said, "and I am grateful that you trusted me enough to tell me." Clara's tears fell faster. She did not try to stop them. "Silas," she whispered, "I want to get better. I want to be your wife, really your wife, but I do not know how." Silas squeezed her hand. "We will figure it out together," he said. "There is no rush. We have time." He smiled. That rare, warm smile that made her heart flutter. "I am not going anywhere, Clara, and neither are you." That night, Clara asked Silas to sleep in the bed again. Not to try anything, just to be near her, to help her get used to his presence without the fear. He agreed. They lay side by side in the darkness, close, but not touching. Clara could feel the warmth of his body, hear the steady rhythm of his breathing. At first her heart raced. The old panic tried to rise up, tried to choke her, but she breathed through it, focused on the present, on this man beside her who had never hurt her, who had never forced her, who had waited and waited and waited. Slowly her heart calmed. After a while her hand slid across the quilt, found his. Their fingers intertwined. Silas squeezed gently. They fell asleep like that, hands linked, hearts healing. The summer passed in a haze of growing things. Clara learned to ride. Silas taught her on a gentle mare named Rosie. At first she was terrified, but Silas was patient. He walked beside her, talked her through every step, until riding felt as natural as breathing. They worked the ranch together. Clara learned to check the cattle, to mend fences, to read the weather. She learned the rhythm of ranch life, hard and demanding but honest. And every night they lay a little closer. Some nights Clara's fear still spiked. The old memories still crept in, uninvited. But Silas was always patient, always willing to wait. And slowly, slowly, the fear began to fade. One night in late August, Clara turned to face him in the darkness. "Silas," she whispered. He opened his eyes. "I want to try," she said. "Really try." Silas searched her face. "Are you sure?" She nodded. She was trembling, but not from fear, from hope, from wanting. "I trust you," she said. Silas moved slowly, carefully. Every touch was a question. Every moment a chance for her to say stop. She did not say stop. There were still moments of panic, moments when the old memories tried to surface. But Clara breathed through them, focused on Silas, on his gentle hands, his soft voice, his patient love. And when it was over, she lay in his arms and cried. But for the first time, they were tears of joy. "I love you," Silas whispered against her hair. "I love you so much, Clara." She pressed closer to him. "I love you too," she whispered back. Outside, the wind sighed through the grass. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, And inside that little house on the Wyoming plain, two wounded hearts finally became one. Autumn came early that year. The leaves on the cottonwoods turned gold and red. The nights grew cold. The cattle started gathering closer to the ranch, sensing the change in the season. Clara had never felt so happy. She woke each morning in Silas's arms. They ate breakfast together, laughing over coffee and eggs. They worked side by side during the day, and at night they came together with a passion that still surprised her. The fear was not completely gone. Some nights it still whispered in the back of her mind. But it no longer controlled her. She had learned that she was stronger than her memories, that love could heal what shame had broken. But happiness, Clara was learning, never lasts forever. The first sign of trouble came on a Thursday morning. Clara was hanging laundry when she saw the rider coming up the long road to the ranch. At first, she thought it was Sheriff Miller coming with news about Sterling. After the church hearing, Sterling had gone quiet. He had not tried anything else, had not burned any more barns, had not made any more legal threats. Some people said he had given up. Others said he was just biding his time. Clara did not trust the silence. But she had been too happy to worry much about it. Now, watching the rider approach, the old fear stirred in her chest. The rider was not Sheriff Miller. He was a stranger, young, maybe 25. He had a hard face and cold eyes. He stopped his horse at the edge of the property and just sat there, watching. Clara went inside and got Silas. By the time they came back out, the rider was gone. "Who was that?" Clara asked. Silas shook his head. His jaw was tight. "I do not know, but I do not like it." Over the next few days, they saw the rider again, sometimes on the ridge overlooking the ranch, sometimes on the road into town, always watching, never approaching. Silas started wearing his gun belt around the house. Clara started having nightmares again. Then the letter came. It arrived on a cold morning in October. Sheriff Miller brought it out himself, his face grim. "This came for you yesterday," he said, handing it to Silas. "I would have brought it sooner, but I wanted to check some things first." Silas opened the letter. Clara watched his face go pale. "What is it?" she asked. Silas handed her the letter without a word. Clara read it slowly. The words were formal, full of legal language. But the message was clear. Sterling was suing them, not for annulment this time, for fraud. He claimed that Silas had misrepresented his land holdings to the bank when he took out his mortgage, that the deed to the ranch was invalid, that the property rightfully belonged to him. It was lies, all of it, but lies backed by expensive lawyers and forged documents. "He is not giving up," Clara said. Her voice shook. "He will never give up." "I know." Silas's face was hard. "But neither will I." Sheriff Miller cleared his throat. "There is more. That stranger you have been seeing around. His name is Cole Dawkins. He is a hired gun, works for Sterling." Clara's blood went cold. "What does Sterling want with a hired gun?" Silas asked. Sheriff Miller hesitated. "Word is, Sterling is done playing legal games. He wants this settled permanent-like." The meaning was clear. Sterling had hired a killer. "Silas," Clara whispered. He pulled her close. "It is going to be all right. I will handle this." But Clara could feel him shaking, and she knew he was just as scared as she was. That night they made plans. Silas would go to town tomorrow, talk to a lawyer about the lawsuit, try to find evidence that Sterling's documents were forged. Clara would stay at the ranch with Jeb and Toby. They were good men, loyal. They would keep her safe. But Clara did not want to be safe. She wanted to fight. "Let me come with you," she said. "Let me help." Silas shook his head. "I need you here. Need to know you are protected. But what if something happens to you?" Clara grabbed his hands. "I cannot lose you, Silas. Not now. Not when we finally—" Her voice broke. Silas cupped her face in his hands. "Nothing is going to happen to me. I promise." He kissed her, slow and sweet and full of love. "I will be back by nightfall," he said, "and then we will figure out our next move together." Clara nodded. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. But deep in her heart, she felt the cold hand of fear closing around her. Something bad was coming. She could feel it in her bones. Silas left for town at first light. Clara stood on the porch and watched him ride away until he was just a speck against the gray morning sky. Her heart ached with a fear she could not name. "Come back to me," she whispered. "Please come back to me." The day dragged by slowly. Clara tried to keep busy. She cleaned the house, she worked in the garden, she helped Jeb repair a section of fence near the barn. But her eyes kept drifting to the road, watching for Silas, praying to see his familiar figure riding home. The sun climbed higher, then began its slow descent toward the mountains. Still no Silas. By late afternoon, Clara's fear had grown into something cold and heavy in her chest. "He should be back by now," she told Jeb. "He said he would be back by nightfall." Jeb frowned. "Maybe he got held up in town. Lot of paperwork with lawyers and such." "Maybe," Clara said. But she did not believe it. When the sun touched the mountains, Clara made a decision. "I am going to town," she announced. "Something is wrong. I can feel it." Jeb tried to stop her. "Mrs. Thorne, it is not safe. That hired gun is still out there. I do not care." Clara was already saddling Rosie. "My husband needs me." She rode hard. The wind cut through her clothes, but she did not slow down. The road stretched out ahead of her, empty and dark. The first stars were appearing in the sky. She was halfway to town when she heard the gunshot. It cracked through the air like thunder. Clara's heart stopped. Then she kicked Rosie into a gallop. She found them at the crossroads. Silas was on the ground, his horse standing nearby. Blood soaked his shirt. Above him stood Cole Dawkins, the hired gun, his pistol still smoking. "No!" Clara screamed. She threw herself off Rosie and ran to Silas. His eyes were open, but glazed with pain. Blood bubbled from a wound in his shoulder. "Clara," he groaned. "What are you doing here? Run! I am not leaving you." Clara pressed her hands against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. Cole Dawkins laughed. "Well, well," he drawled. "The little wife comes to the rescue. Sterling said you might be a problem." He raised his pistol, pointed it at Clara. "Move away from him," he ordered. "This does not have to involve you." Clara did not move. "If you want to kill him," she said, her voice shaking but defiant, "you will have to go through me." Dawkins raised an eyebrow. "You are either very brave or very stupid." "Neither," Clara said. "I just love my husband." Dawkins shrugged. "Suit yourself." He cocked the pistol. Clara's mind raced. She had no weapon, no way to fight. She was going to die here, on this dusty road, holding the man she loved. But at least they would be together. Then a voice cut through the darkness. "Drop the gun, Dawkins!" Dawkins spun around. Sheriff Miller stepped out of the shadows. His rifle was leveled at Dawkins's chest. Behind him stood a group of men from town, neighbors, ranchers, people who had watched Clara stand up in church and tell her truth, people who had decided that enough was enough. "It is over," Sheriff Miller said. "We found Sterling's forged documents. We have testimony that he hired you to kill the Thorns. You can come quietly, or you can die right here." Dawkins's eyes darted around, looking for an escape. But there was none. He was surrounded. Slowly, he lowered his pistol, let it fall into the dirt. Sheriff Miller moved forward with handcuffs. Clara did not watch. She was too busy pressing her hands against Silas's wound, trying to keep him alive. "Stay with me," she begged. "Please, Silas, do not leave me." Silas's hand found hers. His grip was weak, but it was there. "Never," he whispered. "I promised, remember. I am not going anywhere." The next hours were a blur. They got Silas to the doctor. The bullet had missed anything vital, but he had lost a lot of blood. He would survive, the doctor said, but it would take time to heal. Clara sat by his bed all night. She held his hand and watched his chest rise and fall. Every breath he took was proof that he was still alive, still here, still hers. In the morning, Sheriff Miller came to see them. "It is done," he said. Sterling confessed. Well, his lawyer convinced him to confess in exchange for a lighter sentence. He will spend the rest of his life in prison. "And Dawkins?" Silas asked weakly. "Same." The sheriff smiled grimly. "Your land is safe. Your marriage is safe. It is over." Clara started to cry. All those months of fear, all those threats, all those sleepless nights. It was over. Sheriff Miller patted her shoulder awkwardly. "You folks have been through a lot," he said, "but you stuck together. That means something." He tipped his hat and left. Clara looked at Silas. He looked back at her with tired, loving eyes. "We did it," he said. "We survived." Clara leaned down and kissed him gently. "We did more than survive," she whispered. "We won." The months that followed were quiet, good quiet, healing quiet. Silas recovered slowly. The wound in his shoulder took time to heal, and for a while he could not do much around the ranch. But Clara and the hands kept things running. She had learned so much over the past year. She was not the frightened girl who had stepped off that wagon anymore. She was a rancher now, a partner, a wife in every sense of the word. By Christmas, Silas was back on his feet. They celebrated quietly, just the two of them, with a small tree Clara had decorated with ribbon and dried flowers. It was the happiest Christmas Clara had ever known. As winter turned to spring, something else began to change. Clara started feeling sick in the mornings. At first she thought it was just a stomach ailment, something she had eaten. But the sickness persisted, and other changes came with it. She was tired all the time. Her breasts ached. Certain smells that had never bothered her before now made her gag. Finally, she went to see the doctor. He confirmed what she had begun to suspect. She was pregnant. Clara walked home in a daze. Pregnant. A baby. After everything she had been through, after all the years of believing she was too broken for normal things like marriage and family, she was going to be a mother. She could not wait to tell Silas. But she wanted to do it right, to make it special. That evening, after supper, Clara handed Silas a small package wrapped in brown paper. He looked at her curiously. "What is this?" "Open it," she said. Her heart was pounding. Silas untied the string and unfolded the paper. Inside was a tiny flannel shirt, so small it would fit in the palm of his hand. He stared at it for a long moment, then looked up at Clara. His eyes were wide. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Clara smiled through her tears. "I think a little one is coming," she whispered. Silas dropped to his knees. Right there, in the middle of the kitchen, the big, tough rancher fell to his knees and cried. He pressed his forehead against her belly. His large hands spread across her waist, gentle as always. "A baby," he breathed. "Our baby. Our baby," Clara agreed. Silas looked up at her. His weathered face was wet with tears, but he was smiling. That rare, beautiful smile that she loved so much. "I love you," he said. "Both of you, more than anything in this world." Clara ran her fingers through his hair. "I love you too," she whispered. "So much." They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other, dreaming about the future. A future they had built together out of patience and kindness, and a love that had survived everything the world could throw at it. The baby came in September, on a night when the stars filled the sky like scattered diamonds. Clara labored for hours. The pain was intense. But she had known worse pain, and this pain had a purpose. This pain was bringing her child into the world. Silas stayed with her the whole time. He held her hand, wiped her forehead, whispered words of encouragement. "You are the bravest person I know," he said. "You can do this." And she did. When the baby's first cry filled the room, Clara felt something break open in her chest. All the pain, all the fear, all the shame she had carried for so long, it all washed away in a flood of pure, overwhelming love. "A girl," the midwife announced, "a healthy baby girl." She placed the baby in Clara's arms. Clara looked down at her daughter, at the tiny face, red and wrinkled and perfect, at the small fist pressed against a rosebud mouth, at the flutter of eyelashes against soft cheeks. "Hello," Clara whispered. "Hello, my darling." Silas leaned over them both. His hand trembled as he touched the baby's cheek. "She is beautiful," he breathed, "just like her mother." Clara looked up at him, at this man who had waited for her, who had healed her, who had given her everything she never dared to hope for. "What should we name her?" she asked. Silas thought for a moment, then smiled. "Hope," he said. "We should name her Hope." Clara's eyes filled with tears. It was perfect. Hope Thorne. The baby stirred in her arms, making a soft cooing sound. Clara held her closer. "Welcome to the world, Hope," she whispered. "You are so loved." Outside, the wind sighed through the grass. Not harsh and punishing like it had been on that long-ago wedding day. Gentle now, almost like a blessing. Autumn storms came and went. The ranch prospered. The garden grew. Baby Hope grew too, from a tiny newborn into a chubby, smiling infant who filled the house with laughter. One evening, when Hope was 3 months old, Clara and Silas stood on the porch together. The baby was asleep in her cradle inside. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Silas wrapped his arms around Clara from behind. She leaned back against his chest, feeling his warmth, his strength, his love. "I have been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About how much has changed. A year ago I was so scared, so broken. I never thought I could be happy." She turned in his arms to face him. "But look at us now. We have a home, a family, a future. Everything I never dared to dream about." Silas brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You made it happen," he said. "You were brave enough to try, brave enough to heal." Clara shook her head. "We did it together. I could not have done any of it without you." Silas smiled, that smile that still made her heart skip. "I love you, Clara Thorne," he said. "I love you too, Silas," she whispered. "More than this land, more than my own breath." She stood on her tiptoes and kissed him. The wind rustled softly around them. The stars began appearing in the darkening sky. And somewhere inside, their daughter slept peacefully, dreaming whatever dreams babies dream. They stayed on the porch until the last light faded. Then they went inside, to their home, to their family, to the life they had built out of ashes and hope and an unbreakable love. The land was still wild. The world was still harsh. But in that house, wrapped in each other's arms, they had found something rare and precious. They had found home. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.